That old cliche that the only two things certain in life are death and taxes needs an amendment, at least if you're an American. Something else is just as certain and inevitable, namely, the U.S. budget for military and intelligence agencies will increase every year, no matter what. The U.S. is, and for decades has been, the largest military spender in the world by far. The statistics are by now familiar. The U.S. spends more than the 9 highest spending nations combined that come after it. Of all the world's military spending, if you aggregated it all from every nation into one pile, 38% of it is from U.S. spending. And it's not as if the U.S. spends so much more of its military because it has more than anybody else. Of the world's top 10 military spenders, the U.S. also spends the second highest share of its gross domestic product, just after Saudi Arabia. What's most impressive is how inventive and resilient is this web of multi-tentacle war machine which Dwight Eisenhower, 61 years ago, dubbed the military-industrial complex. No matter what is going on in the world, they always find or concoct reasons why the military budget must grow no matter how inflated it already is. Since the end of World War II, the prime justification for pouring so many of our national resources into the coffers of weapon manufacturers was the Cold War. The premise that the United States faced a grave and existential global threat from Soviet communism and thus had to conduct a series of hot wars, proxy wars, and cold wars on every continent on the earth, overthrowing governments in South America, Asia, and the Middle East, installing and propping up dictators, decades-long wars in Korea and Vietnam and Central America, just an endless carousel of conflicts, wars, and internal strife that always required more sophisticated weaponry and an always growing standing army. But then the Soviet Union fell, along with the Berlin Wall. The global communist menace was no more. And in the late 1980s, under the first Bush administration, into the 1990s under Bill Clinton, Americans were promised what was called, quote, a peace dividend. The idea that without an existential threat to face any longer, military spending could and would be substantially reduced, and Americans would enjoy all the benefits in newly funded public infrastructure, social programs, and tax breaks. It worked a little bit for a short while. Military spending did gradually decrease in the late 80s and early 1990s, though always with the U.S. far in the lead in global military spending. But just a few years later, it plateaued. No more decreases, no more peace dividends, in part because the Clinton administration found new wars, inventing the concept of liberal interventionism to lead the U.S. into an ugly and sustained war in Yugoslavia, which CNN, back in 1999, dubbed Madeline's War, represented by Madeleine Albright's response to the view of Colin Powell, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that the U.S. should only involve itself in wars with a clear goal and decisive force, a test which, General Powell argued, U.S. involvement in the war in Yugoslavia did not even come close to meeting. As CNN related, Albright responded, quote, "What's the point of having this superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it?" As Powell later recalled, quote, "I thought I would have an aneurysm." But Albright got her way. That war went on for years. And incidentally, it led to a fairly vicious U.S. bombing campaign over Serbia based on the demand that Kosovo be granted independence from Serbia. It finally was, after it became clear that a majority of people in Kosovo favored such independence, and that led to a refusal to recognize this independence by Russia's Vladimir Putin, a longtime ally of Serbia, who warned that this would create a precedent that could destabilize much of Europe, given how many provinces after World War II were shoved into countries to which they felt no affinity. When that argument was ignored and Kosovo given independence, Putin then used that Kosovo precedent to justify first his 2008 invasion of Georgia to liberate 2 Russian-speaking provinces that clearly identified far more as Russian than Georgian, and is now using the same precedent to justify the annexation of Crimea in 2014, who everyone agrees their citizens overwhelmingly prefer to be under the rule of Moscow than Kiev, and now is doing the same for similar Russian-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine. Just a reminder of how great and widespread and enduring the consequences of various optional U.S. wars typically are. So as you can see from that chart again, the U.S. enjoyed a tiny fleeting peace dividend that began quickly to dissipate as the country fell further and further into armed conflict in the Balkans. And then, of course, came the 9/11 attacks and the 20 years of wars, regime change operations, and multi-country bombing campaigns in various countries that followed it. Military spending quickly doubled after 9/11 with almost no opposition, given that anyone questioning that was vilified as a sympathizer of al-Qaeda, just as anyone questioning Cold War spending was deemed a communist supporter, and anyone questioning the military budget now in Ukraine is deemed a Kremlin asset. The numbers change, they keep going up, but the tactics never do. On top of just pure military spending, after 9/11, the U.S. poured billions and billions more into related national security bureaucracies. A whole new one was created in 2002 with the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. A few Democrats, such as the triple amputee war veteran Senator Max Cleland of Georgia, questioned the necessity for a new sprawling national security bureaucracy, only for Rick Wilson, then a Republican scumbag consultant, now a scumbag with the Democratic Party PAC Lincoln Project, just for him to run ads morphing Max Cleland's face into Osama bin Laden, suggesting that only secret lovers of al-Qaeda could possibly cause anyone to question the need for the Department of Homeland Security. But that dynamic worked, and it meant that military spending exploded for 20 years as the U.S., under Bush and Cheney, and then under Obama-Biden, went to war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, and bombed and tried to regime change all sorts of countries having nothing to do with 9/11, from Somalia and Yemen to Syria and the Philippines. When Trump negotiated the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and then Biden executed that withdrawal in 2021, the arms industry worried, they really did, about where their profits would come from now. There was no reason for that worry, though, as they would have known had they just studied some post-World War II history. A new justification for explosive increases in military spending quickly arrived, as it always has. Less than 9 months after the U.S. left Afghanistan, Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, and all of Boeing's and Raytheon's problems were solved. Just last week, Congress, with very little opposition, passed a military budget of $858 billion, an amount that exceeded what the Biden administration requested by $45 billion. It was an 8% increase from 2021, the Biden administration's request was, when we were all told that the war on terror had finally come to an end after 20 years, and this time we did not even get a pretense of a few months of a peace dividend. As the Times reported on that vote, quote, Congress on Thursday gave final approval to an $858 billion military bill that would increase the Pentagon's budget by 8%, after lawmakers in both chambers overwhelmingly approved the mammoth 4,400-page legislation. You can imagine how many of them who voted for it actually read it. It went on, quote, a far bigger tranche of military spend aid for Kiev is expected to pass through Congress later this year. The Biden administration in November asked lawmakers to approve an additional $38 billion just for Ukraine. And despite growing voices in both parties questioning sending more money, bipartisan support for aiding the Ukrainians has remained strong. This was not giving the Biden White House everything it wanted. It was giving it far more than it asked for. In March of this year, Biden's defense... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.